So search on Etsy is a big conundrum for us. We have about 30 million items in the marketplace. Most of them are unique, handmade, vintage. We don't have SKUs. We don't have a big feed of metadata coming from some other database somewhere. I mean, these are individual people uploading their listings. And one of the challenges is figuring out how do you search that, how do you create effective search tools around this vast marketplace. It has been very hard to find things on Etsy. So we tend to rely a lot on sort of smart merchandising and looking for other kind of trust or quality signals that we can filter into our search algorithm. But there was also kind of a hypothesis within Etsy. There had been an attempt maybe 4 or 5 years ago to create a taxonomy. We'd actually briefly hired a contract taxonomist who came in and tried to create a taxonomy of the site. And it's a very hard problem. How do you categorize a magic wand, right? Is it a toy? Is it a novelty? Is it a gadget? Some questions. Or what about a box of goat bones? Right? I don't know. Is it art? Is it craft supply? So those are the kinds of things we had to kind of wrestle with quite a bit. And at some point, like the team just kind of threw in hands, it's just going to be search. Like keyword search is sort of the thing that we're going to rely on. We're not going to try to create a lot. There was kind of a conventional wisdom within the company that like the browse path just wasn't something worth investing time in because nobody used it. All right, so a great example of, I think, the risk of sort of measuring things within your own little bubble, right? Because we know that just the hypothesis because they're not using it on Etsy, therefore people must not be interested. But the fact is, we didn't really have a very effective browse path. Actually, most of the products in the marketplace you wouldn't even see if you went browsing through categories. The vast majority of things were really only accessible via search. So we've done some data analysis. We know we have this huge marketplace with all these buyers. Also, like a high incidence of what we call low-intent search queries. So people searching for jewelry, Halloween costumes, or things like that, where it's really hard to the conversion rates tend to be lower on those sort of high-level, undefined queries, and therefore we thought there was probably an opportunity there to create a little more of a guided path around those low-intent search queries. But we also did several rounds of research where we didn't look at what people were doing on Etsy. We decided that we kind of took the point of view that most people are actually spending their time somewhere else. What could we learn from that? And so we watched people, we invited people in and watched them use other sites. We watched them use Macy's and Overstock.com and ASOS and Nordstrom and all these other kind of e-commerce sites. Jewelry is a huge category in Etsy, so we focused a little bit on the jewelry experience. And what we found was that people actually do browse. If you provide an effective, well-designed, controlled vocabulary with category trees, people will use it. People weren't using Etsy because ours wasn't very good and it wasn't very well thought out. So based on that insight, we went back to the team and sort of made the case that actually, we need to take another swing at this and try to create, a product taxonomy that we might be able to fold into a browse path and also do more faceted search features and try to figure out how to make it work. It's kind of a daunting project, but we ended up making the case to hire a taxonomist, so we now have a full-time taxonomist. We named Jenny Benevento, who's amazing. She's done a bunch of taxonomy work for other companies, and she spent much of the past year sort of designing that product taxonomy. And now we've got one. So some of the other insights we saw, people that we knew searching felt overwhelming. We also saw that buyers wanted to narrow search results, but they have this kind of fear of missing out. So there's this interesting tension where people they're overwhelmed. They think there's some interesting stuff there they could find, and they kind of want to narrow it down, but they also don't want to narrow it so much that they would miss things. So we saw a lot of people doing sort of iterative keyword searching where they create a query and then add onto it or add qualifiers or try different things. So we were trying to sort of anticipate some of those behaviors by doing a lot of search log analysis and figuring out what kinds of facets or modifiers would make sense for different categories. Anyway, long and short of is we ended up with a taxonomy that really serves two purposes. One is it drives a faceted search, what we call exploratory search engine, that when you do a sort of low intent query like jewelry or gifts or something, we start to expose some facets. And then it also allows us to expose to create a more usable sort of top-level browse tree that we know. So this is actually a result of a card sort that we did where we took sort of the category, in the taxonomist view of the data was on the left, vertical column, all the sort of top-level categories that emerge, but that was too much for us to really effectively expose in a kind of browse path at the top of the site. And so we did a card sort, a sort of secondary level card sort where we then group that into higher level categories, what you see at the top, which is now, as of 2 weeks ago, the new top level sort of site category tree on the site. So, by using that kind of mix of methods, data analysis, user research, competitive analysis, card sorting, we have also done some tree testing, we were able to kind of evolve towards, a much more usable search and browse experience on the site. So, and then we worked with the product design team to start to figure out the best expression of that. As you get into a search, what are the effective ways we could expose this taxonomy and let you sort of find your path? So we experimented with a bunch of alternative designs that sort of started to blur the distinction between a search result and a category page. And ultimately, we landed on something that looks like this. So you come in, you search for jewelry, you get basically a kind of a visually browsable view of top-level associated categories, followed by a set of sort of ranked search results at the bottom, sort of where we ended up. So this is where we ended up, and the conversion outcomes were good, but we were still interested in understanding like what was the effect on customer satisfaction, how do people feel about this, did this make them more likely to return, how could we sort of understand the different dimensions of this change? And so we've been doing a fair amount of sort of survey work. Earlier this year, we hired our first quantitative UX researcher who's been really figuring out how do we create some instrumentation around customer feedback and figure out how do we capture customer sat metrics across the site. So with this particular experiment, we've been able to bake that into our A/B testing environment so that we can basically capture customer sat within an A/B test on variations so that we can then add that to the mix in addition to conversion rates and other more traditional business metrics. To give you a little more detail on what that looks like, some of the things we're looking at, customer satisfaction, look and feel, product browsing. But one of the interesting outcomes of this particular experiment is we sort of expected there would be a positive lift with conversion. We expected that there would be some general satisfaction with search and browse. One of the interesting findings, though, was that we also found that by exposing these facets and these categories, we were able to increase perceptions of the breadth of merchandise offered on Etsy. So it actually filtered into kind of a brand perception issue as well. I think one of the issues we'd seen was that people, or a hypothesis we had was that a lot of people didn't really understand the breadth of what was on Etsy. They just think, kooky gifts and, crochet and doilies and things like that. And so by actually, providing those kind of subtle cues that there's all the other stuff, it actually did create a lift in sort of perceptions of breadth of product, which we think boosts sort of the brand perception, which we think is a long-term sort of conversion outcome, but it's a little hard to prove that. So let's see. So this just gives you a little bit of visibility on some of the things we're looking at in terms of trying to measure different dimensions of the customer experience and starting to quantify that and introducing that sort of quantitative UX data as an additional business metric that we can look at in addition to the more traditional kind of metrics around revenue and conversion and things like that. So.